There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another kind of book club type discussion with three bookish social media luminaries. We are here to talk about I think it's a novella. Yeah, a novella by Edith Wharton from 1917, if I'm remembering correctly. Summer. And I am joined here by Chris Wolak of the Cougars and many other fabulous things she's got going on, but you probably know her if you know her from the Book Cougars. Chris is joining us from Connecticut, and Dorian Stuber of bookish Twitter fame and his blog, which I really practiced the last time we did something to pronounce it, and I didn't get a chance to practice. So Dorian can tell you the name of it. It's a wonderful book blog, and also a co-host of the bookish podcast, One Bright Book. Dorian is joining us from Arkansas, and the preeminent bookish critic on Twitter, James Morrison, and also author of his debut novel, Gibbons, or One Bloody Thing After Another. And Dorian and I co-hosted the online book launch for that, and he is joining us from Adelaide, Australia. So I'd like to just go around the circle here and find out what you thought of this book in 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll just get into the weeds. So why don't we start with Chris? What did you think of Summer by Edith Wharton?
Oh, I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I had Edith Wharton seminar in grad school, and we did not read Summer. I don't even think I heard about it back then. We read Ethan Frome. And so it was last year I was at the Mount, Edith Wharton's home, and one of the employees there mentioned that Summer was her hot Ethan Frome. That's how Edith Wharton referred to it. And my mind immediately went to hot as in sexy, which not the case at all. Ethan Frome's in the winter, Summer's in the summer. Okay. But I reread Ethan Frome before reading Summer, since Edith Wharton had a connection. They're so bleak, both of the stories, very bleak. And reading them back to back was interesting, but you certainly don't have to. Yeah, I was kind of shocked by some things. I don't want to give spoilers too early on or anything, but I was shocked by the pretty blatant open discussion of sexuality and abortion. That was pretty surprising for a novel from that time period, I thought.
Great. Dorian.
I mean, I don't know if it's hot in that more contemporary sense, but it's certainly, as you say, Chris, very frank about sex, right? And I really admired that about it. I loved it too. I thought it was so great, and I like Wharton very much. I read Age of Innocence in college, and I totally missed the point of that at the time. Not that I disliked it or anything, but I reread it maybe 3 years ago now, and I was like astounded to see the way that I had, her play with narrative voice and point of view so subtle. I was like, I thought Newland Archer was a good guy, and so I just really fell into the trap of that novel, and that set me off on a kind of kick of like reading a number of other of her novels, Custom of the Country and House of Mirth and The Reef, which I like a lot too, and doesn't seem to get that much attention, but I was really taken with this book, and a really different kind of. At least I haven't read Ethan Frome, and I think it's more similar to that one. But in terms of the class, the world that we're seeing in this book, it felt very different from the other Wharton novels that I've read of hers.
And James.
Yeah, I mean, I loved it too. I've read it once before, probably about 20 odd years ago, and I remember loving it. But I realized rereading it, I retained almost nothing about it other than the kind of fact that it was like Ethan Frome, the kind of outlier in her work, in that they're the sort of small town, middle lower class character novels, and that was about all I remembered. So rereading it, yes, again, as everyone else has said, I was really surprised by the sexual frankness of it. Not that she could write that, because I mean, for example, in her unpublished work, there's something connected to this. She was planning on writing a novel about incest that never happened. And you can certainly see elements of that bleeding into this. Again, I'm not sure how much of the plot we want to talk about for people who haven't read it. But yeah, the frankness of something that was published in 1917 is quite startling. I mean, I'm not sure I'd say it was my favorite of her works, because I've read most of her stuff and she's so good. And maybe just because this one wasn't quite as dialogue driven as some of her other books, I really love that. But having said that, this is great. It's almost in some ways felt like, except for the sexual aspects of it, her writing a more 19th century novel in some ways. Partly maybe I'm just thinking that because towards the end there's a very big coincidence of the sort you get a lot of in Victorian fiction that you don't tend to get in her work otherwise. It's, yes, an outlier in her work, but one I really, really enjoyed.
Holy smokes! Well, we're going to have a great discussion. I'm glad I went right after James. I would come down a little bit harder on it than James did, but I am glad I read it. I liked it, but I didn't love it. And what I didn't like was I didn't think the characters were very interesting or well drawn. There was a lot of really fascinating stuff in it. Yeah, so talk. Yeah, we'll get into it. I found them all pretty
That's too
boring.
wrong, but okay, keep talking. That's fine.
and not, but yet the story wasn't boring at all, and there was a lot of fascinating things going on. And I thought it ended a lot more strongly than it began. It took me a long time to get invested in it, and then maybe the second half, I was invested, but I was still thinking, these characters are just kind of not only half there. It's not really making sense to me. So let's get into it. And this will be a spoiler-free discussion for the first part of the video, and we will move into spoiler territory later on, and you will be amply warned. You will be free to continue watching or not, but you can make your own decision then. So I'm just going to give a quick summary of the novella. It is set in the New England village of North Dormer, and our protagonist is Charity Royale, and she comes from a community of ne'er-do-wells, criminals. I'm not sure how we would describe that community, up on the mountain, and she gets adopted by the town lawyer and kind of raised as a foster child. And as the story opens, she is of age. I think she might be around 20, but somebody can correct me. And
15.
She is how old?
Yeah, 15.
15.
Are you kidding me? Oh my God, that changes everything. She's about 15, and she's got a part-time job as the village librarian. Her widower foster father, if that's what we're calling him, is the town attorney, and a young man comes to stay with his aunt in town, and plot ensues that's kind of a romantic nature, and then there's lots of stuff after that. Is that an adequate summary? Somebody want to add to that or correct anything?
Well, the young man, Lucius Harney, comes up from the city, right? At least I think he comes up from New York, and he is particularly interested in old architecture, old houses in the area. He's kind of got this project. He's like an architect, or he's studying to be an architect. I've actually forgotten that, but he seems to come from a social class where actually having to practice it for a living is not really important. But he is making a kind of study of the buildings in the region, and he's sketching them all, and that provides plenty of opportunities for him and Charity to spend time alone in ways they might not otherwise be able to.
Right. Yeah, because she drives him around. He hires the uncle's wagon or something, and she drives him around to all of these places because she knows the area, obviously, and she only works for those like 4 hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
And yeah, as you say, the fact that he's investigating all these old houses means that, for example, at one point in the book, it's thought she spent time at his house, even though she never even went in and never saw him like face to face. And that's a huge scandal because they're out in the countryside. They find an old abandoned house where they're actually able to spend a huge amount of time together and no one knows about it. And that's sort of away from the eye of this community where everybody's paying attention to what everybody does.
Yeah, so there's this interplay between like the fact that everyone is under surveillance all the time within the town, which is a super tiny town, and the smallness and kind of pitifulness of it, if I could put it that way, at least sort of, channeling Charity there, is mentioned many times in the novel. So that surveillance constant. On the other hand, then there is like the ability to be free from that. That's connected to both nature, but also to this idea of like the idea of the dwelling of houses just seems super important in this book. So,
Mm-hmm.
Good observation. So how do we want to get started? Who wants to grab a ball and run with it?
Well, I would just say I can see what you mean, Shawn, when you were talking about the characters not being interesting. Not that I agree with you, but I think it's, for me, it's more that
Because he's
she
wrong.
yeah, it's more that she, I don't know, very effectively depicted a whole lot of very stunted lives. Just people who, either through lack of opportunity or from their own personal failings or both, just their lives have closed down to this tiny little, movements in this tiny little town. I mean, Charity is fighting against that the whole time to varying success. And her adopted father, for example, through his own failings, as his life has closed down more and more and more. He used to spend a lot more time out in the world, but now, he occasionally goes off on a spree to the nearest city. But other than that, he has this barely running practice, really, as a lawyer, and rarely goes anywhere. And I think that's the case for almost everybody else in the book, except, yes, for the architect, who comes in from the outside world. And the only other people you see who live in the outside world are people who came from North Burma and have sort of been forced to flee because of their own behavior. I mean, this ties into the sexual stuff we were talking about before, because there's what everyone obviously knows, there's an abortionist, a doctor in the big town, and everyone knows that she's an abortionist, though no one, actively talks about it, and she's still able to operate. But I mean, for example, someone Charity used to know who now doesn't live in the town anymore because she visited the abortionist, and now she lives elsewhere, and her life has expanded, but to the cost of not being able to be sort of talked to by people she used to know. So It's more the stuntedness of the lives, I think, rather than them being, well, for me personally, not being interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I'm going to think on that as I hear the rest of the discussion. And just before we get to Chris, I want to add one more thing that I should have said, which is that I took a graduate English class on James, Wharton, and Cather, and I read a lot of Wharton and loved it, and also reread Ethan Frome recently and loved it. So I was comparing this to what I had read, and just it paled in comparison. That's where I was referring. So
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I agree with James about the characters living stunted lives, because I think she really does that well in both Ethan Frome and Summer, just showing the limitations that this small town has put on people. And then, talking about class issues, that people really don't have the opportunities to go, seek their fortunes in this time period and in this place. And it was really kind of heartbreaking that Charity kind of is that typical teenager who thinks she knows. She knows the deal. She's going to be fine. And these other women in the town who want her to go away to school to get her out of her foster father's house, because they understand what could be happening now that she's a more mature teenager, but she doesn't want that. And I know part of this is, I don't want to get into spoiler territory, as so many teenagers do. They learn lessons in challenging ways, but I really appreciated Wharton's humor in this novel, in the novella, whatever we're going to call it, much, and that was lacking in Ethan Frome. But I thought the humor and the sarcasm in Summer was fantastic, especially regarding Charity and showing her spark. In that library, she's the librarian and she hates books. She hates the library. She thinks they're smelly and musty. She even has one book she especially dislikes because it's floppy and it's always falling over or getting lost between other books. And so I think there's a lot more life to her than at first meets the eye.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, she's right to hate those books, because that library is mausoleum. No one reads those books. It's the only thing in this little town which has nothing, but it does have this library because of some kind of weird bequest situation. But she's more honest about it than everyone else, right? She doesn't have any kind of sanctimoniousness or high-mindedness or something like this about about the power of art or something like that, right? I mean, she wants that job because it's the only job she can get in the village, and she wants some money because one day she wants to leave or to have something for herself, and she's very determined about that from the beginning. And I was really struck by the way that being stuck, being constricted, being confined is maybe the great theme in Wharton. And it's fascinating for me to see her do this with a character who's not wealthy, So this isn't like Age of Innocence. This isn't like House of Mirth, right? But who's super constricted from her kind of like her class and geographic and situation as well as her gender, but who has like so much. She has a lot of self-knowledge, I think. Like there are things that she is going to learn over the course of this book for sure. Like she doesn't quite have the world figured out the way she thinks she is. I agree with you there, Chris. But I was surprised and kind of like impressed how much. I don't know, like kind of, I don't know if self-awareness is quite the right word, actually, but she is just not a pushover. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Mm.
Not a pushover, I think, is the perfect way to describe it. Yeah.
It's just something I was thinking about reading it. Her friendship with Henry James is often brought up, and they're often contrasted as writers. And it did make me think reading this that I made the mistake once of reading Henry James's very first novel, which he basically tried to suppress during his own lifetime, called Watch and Ward, which is a not great book, it has to be said, about a man who adopts a little girl with the intent of raising her to be his perfect wife. And it's a deeply creepy and uncomfortable book because of that. But just, I wondered if that, I don't know, was in the back of Edith Wharton's mind. This certainly is a reflection of that idea, except with the added complications of who her real father might have been. But it certainly takes a much more honest look at that kind of mindset, deeply unpleasant implications of that kind of situation.
Yeah, well, the wife was around though when they first brought Charity to the home. I think like for the first 7 years, Charity was there, and then she died. And I mean, that's an interesting thing about Mr. Royale and his character as a man and his circumstances and his practice, how it's kind of gone dry, I guess, for lack of a better word, as he's hit the bottle a lot more. And so I just wonder about his character arc in this story. Is he a bad guy, or is there something a little bit more complex going on with him as a character?
And I think we can easily have a really great discussion of it in a spoiler-free way, and we may add more once we get behind the spoiler wall. But yes, great question. And now, just while I've got the floor, I want to say to James, yeah, I made the mistake of reading Henry James. Full stop.
You're just full of bad opinions today here, Shawn.
Yeah. Well, I normally like Henry James, except some of the long dictated later stuff, which doesn't do it for me so much. But yeah, the very first novel, he was right to suppress it, and it probably should have stayed suppressed ever since.
It's apocryphal, but I hope and pray that it's true. That Thomas Hardy once said of Henry James, he chewed more than he bit off.
Yeah. Well, I was like H.G. Wells talking about it as like trying to watch a hippopotamus trying to pick up a pea. Yeah.
Oh, God.
You got to be a giant for everyone to come so hard at you that way, though.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, yeah, let's pick up Chris's point about that, and I think this can remain in the spoiler-free land, because I feel like a crucial part of understanding him and of understanding the novel more generally is in the speech that he gives. Is it for 4th of July? Why are they having this ceremony? I forgot. They're having a big
home week.
Yeah.
Home week.
Yeah.
Home week.
4th of July is a separate incident in the novel. That's right. It's different. Okay. So have this home week, and they get people who are from North Dormer can get to come back or whatever. And there's like a sort of a pageant that the young girls put on, and concert, and the preacher who comes to town like once a month from another neighboring town is giving a speech, etc. And then Mr. Royal gives the speech, right? And like a really good speech, I think. Like, I guess that's my question about so the gist of the speech is about the difference between like going away and then having to come home because you have flunked out, you just haven't made it, you tried to get to New York and it didn't work out, that kind of thing, versus like choosing to come home or coming home and embracing that. And you said something to the effect of and doing good thereby or something. It's a moment where Charity, who has for various reasons kind of like almost stopped, speaking to her foster father, pays real attention to that. And it's certainly a moment in terms of the trajectory or whatever, where I felt as a reader, it was like, I need to think differently about this person, this character, right? So I guess I want to pose it as a question to you all. Like, how seriously do you think the novel wants us to take that moment? Like, are we supposed to sort of be like impressed and in sympathy with what Royal has to say there? Or do we think that that is a kind of attempt at self-justification, a kind of attempt to kind of like paper over what is, has really been a failure, and or some other way entirely that I have not thought about how we
I want to do a plot point check. Didn't this happen after Charity and her Lucius where he saw them together at the whatever it was and called her nasty names? That speech was after that, wasn't it?
That speech is after that. Yes,
Yes.
that is that 4th of July celebration where Lucius takes
That's right.
Charity to 2 towns over, something, the biggest place, like kind of a resort place. It's on a lake. It's probably a real place in the Berkshires. I don't know the Berkshires. I'm sorry. And yeah, they run into Mr. Royal, who is drunk, and he's with some women of ill repute, and he calls Charity something very unpleasant. Absolutely. And it seems like
Yes.
kind of sort of the nadir of their relationship. So the speech, the home week is definitely after that.
So for me, that complicated him in a way that maybe by the end of this discussion, I'll be convinced that he was a well-drawn character, but certainly that juxtaposition I thought was important. Chris, what were you going to say?
Well, I'm just thinking about this, like how much of what we see of him prior to that is through Charity's eyes. We get these, like, she's very aware of Mr. Royale and what she can do and say to him to make him kind of stop and have her space from him. And she was also really aware of her foster mother as well. There were some comments about that she really understood their natures and everything. So looking at Charity as a character and her own blind spots, for lack of a better word, as a young person who doesn't really know the world, like how much are we seeing him through her eyes? And then does it shift with that speech? And, because we're seeing the speech maybe from more of an eagle eye perspective.
I think too, because as you say, we mainly see him from Charity's point of view. And since, an incident early on in the novel, she has deliberately chosen to or ignore him almost as much as possible. Like they coexist in this house, but she's trying her absolute best basically to shut him out of her life, and that involves shutting out any awareness of his life. And so this is kind of the first time as readers, certainly, that we kind of have any real insight into his own inner life, and certainly something that she's been actively trying to not see for a long time. And I mean, I think as to what Dorian was asking, it is a genuinely felt speech, but it does have, I think, as you say, sort of self-justificatory elements. It's sort of putting an honest, but also probably the best, most positive spin he can put on his own life, because you can see the limitations he's put on himself through his, own failures, through his career failures, through his drinking and ladies of ill repute hanging out with. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, and that just makes him so interesting to me. There are a lot of incidents for a very short book that we have to tiptoe around, which tells us that it's very dramatic in certain ways. You know what I mean? Like, because of this thing that has happened earlier in the book, I think we as readers are in full sympathy with Charity's refusal to engage, right? And it's actually really impressive the way she shuts him down and kind of out of her life because she's in a position of dependency, economic dependency to him, but that doesn't seem to matter, right? So we're in full support of that. But then the speech is an important moment in kind of changing that. I'm interested in hearing you call it as a glimpse of his inner life because that's what I just don't know, right? Like, it's a speech, and I can't tell if it's like how heartfelt is it? Like, how much is this actually something that he's thinking and believing, or how much is this kind of and I'm inclined to agree with you, James, that I think that he does, but there is that element of self-justification, and so that just makes him a really hard guy to get a handle on, and I really found that fascinating.
And your question makes me want to go back and reread the speech more closely, but based on my memory, I just read it earlier today. It's very much about sense of community, and it's complicated for us, the reader, because we know how insular and you're either in or out, and you can be tarred and feathered and sent out, especially if you're a woman. And he goes to other towns to do his dirty deeds and then comes home. So there's a whole bunch of complications that I think rereading it, I've been able to tease out even more about that speech. What does it leave out? How all encompassing is his vision of community compared to what's actually
exactly.
going on in North Dormer?
Well, it leaves out the mountain, right? So the mountain is the place where she charities from. And, I liked, Shawn, the way you put it with the ne'er-do-wells. I mean, maybe in Arkansas, something people would say is that those are PWT, poor white trash. Like that's who lives on the mountain. I mean, like it's kind of this like community of like, it's sort of presented as a community of addicts, actually, is the way I read it. I mean, they're sort of, maybe, I don't know if they're bootleggers, or there's certainly like moonshine seems to be the drug of choice there, although it's kind of depicted in maybe even more generic sort of like version, right? But that seems to be this like place of exclusion that allows a place like North Dormer to have its good sense of itself, right? Except that there's nothing but like interchange between these places, right? Like that seem to be so radically separated in mentality wise, but also in terms of geography. Like it's really hard to get there. There's a sort of arduous journey there at one point that's described, right? Like just the very fact of Charity's existence. And then there's also this character of the priest who goes up there for funerals and stuff all the time. There's another character from that community who's a logger, and he seems to kind of be all over the place. My point here simply is that there is a part of North Dormer's psyche that is like totally built on the idea that it is radically separated from a place like the mountain. But the facts of the novel seem to suggest that that is not true.
And isn't the house where Lucius and Charity meet, isn't it halfway up the mountain or on the way up that mountain?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
So there's something kind
Yeah.
of symbolic, or
For sure.
It's also weird because the mountain, the people who actually live on the mountain, their lives are almost frozen. There's this kind of feeling that, whenever anyone goes up there, except for maybe birth and death, nothing actually happens. It's almost like the people are almost immobilized. The places she goes, people basically just sit in a house muttering to themselves or sleeping or, barely moving. It's a place where almost nothing happens.
But James, that's kind of how you describe North Dormer too. Now that I think of it,
that's
right?
Yeah.
There's just gradations of
and again, we
nothing
only
happening.
see that from
Not so different. Yeah.
She's a semi-outsider, but nothing happens in front of her except people just sitting there or sleeping or, at one point digging a grave, I guess. But that's about it.
Oh, that scene was so tense when she and Lucius go there, and they're caught in that rainstorm, and they're in that house with the family. That was just so full of tension, that scene, I thought. And so much of the mountain, like it made me feel like it was the American South. Like I just kept picturing, Sissy Spacek and Coal Miner's Daughter, and the mountain folk. And yeah, so I think it is just, somebody just said a variation, or what was the word that somebody just used? In terms of a grid, in terms of nothing happening seemingly. But just the oh gosh, I don't want to go into the last lines of the story yet. So I do have a question about Mr. Royale. If we could just go back to him for a second. It just dawned on me, like, is he actually cavorting with the woman who was kicked out of town, who now lives in the larger city?
Yes.
As just a friend or as a lover?
Well, according to the scholar who wrote the introduction to the Oxford, I didn't necessarily get that she was her lady of the evening, but this scholar says that that's what was going on.
Okay, because I was wondering, like, maybe they're just friends because they both lived in this former community, because I don't get a sense of everybody else's age necessarily. So just in my my thinking about Mr. Royale and what type of character he is, I'm just kind of wondering about that scene too, and who he was hanging around with and why.
Yeah.
I mean, if there really is a friendship there between them, then I think that would be yet again another kind of wrinkle in terms of our understanding of him. I mean, I took that as sort of like just another one of these signs in the first half of the novel of his kind of like degradation, and like just the way this person has sort of squandered his talents and his humanity and stuff like this, right? I kind of like this possibility that he's like friends with her, because I think it would actually complicate it in a way. But I don't know that there's enough to support it, like
Yeah, this professor is Laura Rattray, and according to her, that young woman that had to leave North Dormer and went to the whatever the other slightly bigger town is called, she became a prostitute, and that she was that Mr. Royal had hired her. And also, Laura Rattray says that Charity considered her when she was considering her options, that she specifically considered becoming a prostitute, and I missed that if it was there.
No, I didn't get that.
I don't know that there's evidence that he hired her.
I think all we know is that they were together on the evening along with a couple of other women. And the implication certainly is that she's a prostitute and he's with her. But as you say, that's not clearly stated. And again, we all see this through Charity's viewpoint, effectively. I mean, it's not in first person, but all from her viewpoint. So, then there's the limitations of what she understands about the world too. I guess partly I assumed it too because of just the force of his reaction. Then when he sees Charity and the names he immediately chooses to call her reflect particularly badly because of what we assume he's just been doing. But
so we're now going to move into spoiler territory. If you want to keep watching, we hope you do. But if you want to avoid the spoilers, you need to turn us off now. Go read the book and come back. So
you can read the book. You can read the book in like a day. Very short. So just read the book and then come back and watch the rest of this, and totally worth it.
That's right. So what do we want to spoil first?
Oh my God. I don't even know where to start.
One of the things I struggled with about Charity was that she seemed so, what's the right word? Tight and asexual and nervous and completely repressed. And yet I thought the depiction of the sex in the book that she was having with Lucius was really quite beautiful, quite sensual. And I wasn't sure that I was convinced of that evolution by turning from page 14 onto page 15 I could quite believe it. Did anybody else have anything to say about that?
You're saying she was uptight and repressed?
About her sexuality.
Oh, I didn't get that at all.
Oh, I got it very
I didn't get that.
Yeah, I got it that like she was escaping the library and going onto the hill and laying in nature. And I mean, there's these beautiful descriptions of like the wind fingering her dress, and she's putting her face into the lavender or whatever the plant was. I can't exactly say. Yeah. I mean, and that happens really early on. And I just felt like it was very sexual and sensual, and that, she's a young girl coming into her sense of sexuality.
I think I emphasized the wrong thing. What I was really talking about was the way she was kind of dealing with her interest in and her analysis of what Lucius' interest in her was. There was like she was just so uptight about all that in a way where he's not, he'd just being that way, and I would never get married to him and all that stuff. That's really what I was basing it on. Yeah.
Interesting. I thought she had scorn for the other men of the community, and so then when Lucius arrives, she is definitely initially most drawn to the fact that he seems to find her very attractive, like that she keeps coming back to the way that she could make him kind of pause and sort of forget what he was saying when he first comes into the library. But I took that to be a kind of assertion there of like it's a kind of power that she has, that she can kind of, because as a person who's disempowered in many ways. And so she kind of like clings to that. And I feel like she's very untrusting that this is going to go well for her, which is, she's right to do ultimately. Right. So I felt that it was sort of like she was sort of, there's a lot of mulling that over it for her, I feel like, but I didn't read that as sort of, repressed or frigid or tight or anything.
She's, because even from the start, while he's simultaneously charmed by her, from the very beginning, he also has a tendency, which I think she finds both frustrating but intriguing, of being charmed by her, but also not listening to what she's saying. So, he'll get her into trouble inadvertently. She'll try to explain what happened, and he'll latch onto one thing she said, then go off on some reverie of his own, and then so he's both appalled by the idea he might have got her into trouble, and he likes her and wants to protect her, but he's also incapable of really listening to what she has to say.
He totally doesn't deserve her.
No, exactly. And it's also interesting that the only person you've ever seen in the book that she's been interested in before is the minister, who is also about the only other person she knows who comes from out of town. And she's interested in him and drawn to him. And then, of course, she finds out, to her astonishment, that he has a wife and child. Not that he ever does anything to encourage her interest, but just it doesn't repeat, it foreshadows exactly what's going to happen again, because the next person she falls in love with, who comes from out of town, already has a fiance out of town. It's exactly the same thing again. It's just that this person actually encourages her interest.
Right.
Well, in the beginning when they meet, so the book cougars were doing this year of reading romance, the genre, and kind of studying the genre. It's not one I'm totally familiar with, but I've seen enough rom-coms in my day to latch onto a meet cute when I see one. And so when she's sitting there bored to tears in the library and he comes in and says something about the books being dusty, like, she just snaps. She has a real quick temper. And so they're, it's like the whole enemies to lovers kind of trope is what's going on in this story. And you can almost see it on the big screen. And I love that beginning part of their relationship, and the aunt who's trying off screen, but, trying to mediate what's going on, since she is the one who has the money for the library. So I just thought that was really well done. And it just shows Charity and her short temper and how impulsive she is.
Well, I'm a minority of one here, but what the discussion has shown me is that I probably misread things because I didn't realize she was only 15. So I guess I better go back and read it again. I thought she was about 20. Behind the spoiler wall,
I think she's 15 at the very start, but an uncertain amount of time passes early on.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's unclear. But she's still very young, though, I think. Yeah.
The central issue behind the spoiler wall is, what do we make of the ending? And so who wants to go first? So the ending, I'll summarize the ending. She gets pregnant. Lucius is engaged to the other woman. She lets him go and doesn't tell him about her pregnancy, and her foster father offers to marry her, and they get married. So what did you make of all that, Chris?
Oh gosh. You know what? When I first read this, I was really disgusted by Mr. Royale and his overtures to her earlier on in the book. And so, here she's pregnant and not willing to tell the father about it, and she goes up to the mountain thinking she's going to find her people, as they say earlier on in the book, like the mountain people would never harm her. So she's going to try and see her birth mother. And the line, what is the line in the book? It's the savage misery of the mountain farmers. That was really just, that kind of encapsulates just the brutality of how people were living up there. And I think she saw what her future would hold, and that he was the only option for her other than dying. And she goes through this whole thing of, which it didn't seem very Wharton-ish to me, where she starts thinking about only her baby and not her own life. That seemed to be a really quick flip in that happened. So upon first reading, I thought it was talking about it feeling like a 19th century novel. It felt like a 19th century wrap up of a situation. Not that everybody's going to live happily ever after, but no one's, she's not going to end up destitute on the street or a prostitute in the next town over. But then upon reflection and thinking about the story and how much are we getting through Charity's eyes, in perspective. Is he really a lecherous kind of guy, or are we misled about him? And is he actually doing the right thing because he cares about her? I don't know. Because he says, doesn't he say at one point, like, the one good thing about age is that you come to understand what matters and what doesn't. And that's pretty much the only kindness of age. And so I just wonder about that. Like, if they do marry, and what is the future? What is part 2 for them?
Despite my misgivings about the characterization, I was moved by the ending. I was moved by him. I did believe it was believable the way, he sat at the bed, didn't come into bed with her that first night and all that, and her realizing what he was communicating by that. And all of that I thought was quite moving. He apologizes to her at least twice, maybe 3 times for this incident that we haven't described, where he comes home drunk one night, fairly early in the novel, and makes a pass at her, comes into her bedroom. And so does our understanding of the ending, does it depend on how sincere we believe he was in those apologies? Because that's what my mind kept going back to. Do I believe were those apologies sincere or not?
Well,
I think
to me, it goes back to the question of the speech. Again, the sense of, like, because at the end they come home together, right, as husband and wife now, and I just think it's incredibly fascinating how ambiguous that is. Like, I do tend to read it as a moment of total doom, but I do think that it's also not quite fully that, and I think there is a way that you can kind of imagine that, like, this isn't just a terrible sort of settling or something, like, on her part, but that, I mean, the question of charity, is there any charity in this book? Like, I think her decision to not go away to school when she could have, and to stay because she knows he will be, like, desperate without her, seems like a real act of charity. And maybe we can read his change of heart and his, as Chris, as you said, that moment of, like, recognizing what really matters as a kind of potential sort of form of charity there too. Like, I think the book asks you to think about whether that's a real thing or not. And I really admire the way it kind of, like, leaves us on the knife edge there, just as I am having a hard time deciding whether or not he is just being self-exculpatory there in his speech about, like, making the best of bad situation when he's talking about doing good, coming home and choosing it and doing good. So too, I am left kind of really beautifully uncertain about the end.
I mean, I think that's all true, because I think he is genuine in his apologies, and I think he is genuine in his speech. But I think it's also true that once they're married, once they're living together in that house, once, probably the baby's born, he's going to come home drunk one night and do something horrible, because he's still an alcoholic. He's still, and now he has the social license, I guess, to do what he wants to do. So even if he's telling himself, on that first night, that he's going to be respectful and kindly, they've got a lot of life still ahead of them, and I think terrible things will happen in it.
Let me ask you guys this: is he her father?
This is all very Woody Allen-esque question.
Like how does she get there in the first place? Like, how does he know that, like, there's this girl up there who, like, he needs to go and
you mean biologically her father?
Yeah.
I mean, actually her father. I mean, actually her father.
Because the guy who's supposedly her father, he represents, and when that guy gets put away, he basically goes up to take the child from the mother, because she wouldn't be able to look after the child on her own. But there's no explanation as to why this child, of all the children being born on the mountain,
that's what I'm saying.
He has some personal interest. So my assumption is that he's a biological father, partly, as I say, influenced by the fact of this being something that I know she, Wharton was interested in writing about, but never wrote the novel about it. She was going to. So,
so you agree with me? I thought I was just being a little bit insane with this, but, like, because I mean, of course, there is the way in which, like, he is figured sort of like symbolically in some way as a father, and their age difference and all that stuff, and that's part of like what's weird and everything, but I do kind of like had this feeling that there's this way in which like it's actually the biological one. I'm glad to hear that I'm not the only.
Yeah, I mean, he either,
Well,
my assumption is he either is
That's
or
bleak.
he thinks there's a good chance he is her father because of having slept with the mother. But that again, that's my assumption. But yeah,
It's interesting because they do mention that his wife was sick for quite a while and not doing well. So if he is going out to get his quote needs met, other places, going up the mountain or going to the other town. And there are several references to blood and tainted blood and fate as well. So that's interesting too, to think about that in terms of blood relationships.
well, I can't hang on to my optimistic reading of the ending if this is biological.
Yeah, sorry, ruin things.
It'll be fine as long as they don't do the DNA test. It's going to be fine.
Oh, gosh.
My
Wow,
God,
I mean, that's just like, wow, I did not think about him being the biological father. So now I'm twirling a little bit on the inside here about that.
One thing I thought was interesting is the fact for a novel about an oppressive small town, it was impressive that it conjured up that feeling of oppression of everyone keeping an eye on you without there being any actual villains. There was no, I mean, even the person you might expect to be the kind of interfering matriarchal figure, the architect's aunt whose name I've forgotten, she barely actually figures in the book. She's away a lot of the time. So it very effectively conjures up this oppression of just the feeling of the place, but there's not anyone particular who's the baddie. And I think that makes it stronger. It makes it less cliched, less sort of 19th century in that respect. I thought it was quite impressively done.
There's just a lot to admire in this very short book, I think. I mean, Chris, you mentioned a while back, sort of in passing, the descriptions of the natural world, which are like amazing, I thought, especially then at the end of the book when we have, the summer is over literally, and the big first storm of fall and the dramatic flight up the mountain as that's happening and all that stuff. I thought that was pretty incredible, but so too those much more low-key moments of when he's sketching early in their relationship with Lucius and Charity, and he'll be sketching something and she's like kind of lolling in the grass, smelling the lavender, as you say, like just very evocatively done, and yet economically done too. So I feel like you just get a whole lot happening in what is it, 150 pages or something,
And she could do, I mean, she's a phenomenal short story writer. She could work so well at, these amazing stories at sort of 20 pages. And she wrote so many short stories. I've got a couple of massive.
I've got to read those. I have never read any of those, so I really got to read some of those.
Oh,
yeah.
she's so good.
Yeah.
Some of her best stuff is in her short stories. It's amazing.
And good ghost
My
stories
favorite is-
too. I just really, again, was pleasantly surprised by this story, and I just wanted to share one of my favorite lines as a librarian. I appreciate this. So it's early on when she's talking about the library, and Washington Irving and Fitzgreen Halleck are, two authors who are already kind of outdated by this time. And so she's talking about, so here, every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, she sat at her desk under a freckled steel engraving of the deceased author and wondered if he felt any deader in his grave than she did in his library. I mean, there's some laugh out loud moments in this for me, which
funny, right?
was surprising.
She's a great character.
Well, my closing comments. Well, I got lots to think about. I still felt that compared to other Edith Wharton fiction, the characters were not as deeply drawn or as well drawn for me. But I think I also have a lot of things. Well, as I said, I have a lot of things to think about. What this discussion has shown me, as well as that, is how well drawn you characters are, James, Dorian, and Chris. So thank you very much for such a rousing discussion of Edith Wharton's Summer. Are we going to do another book down the pipe?
Please.
I would 100% do it.
Yeah.
Thank you for this chat.
Totally.
This book.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
We'll have that chat offline. So thanks everybody for watching.